Hello everyone, my name is Upasana Goswami. I and Trushali Dodia and Ghansham Kataria deal with the article translation and the shaping of modernist poetic discourse in Indian poetry. This article by E.V. Ramakrishnan. He was a writer, poet and literary critic. He was got Kerala Sahitya Academy Award, for literary criticism and recently he got award 2023 Sahitya Academy Award for a literary study Malayalam novelist Desha Kannal. Uh, these are a table of content for abstract. The chapter examined the important role of a translation in a shaping modernist poetry in a major Indian language between 1950 and 1970. How a translation was prevalent shaping a modernist poetic discourse in a major Indian literary. Literary criticism. It analyzed how translation of a major European modernist introduced new idea of a distributed prevalence prevailing literary sensibility. Many leading Indian modernists were also translation using foreignize method. The chapter study poet like the Datta. Like Datta Mardekar and Panikar to understand the selective assimilation of a Western modernism on a post-colonial term. In this article, also argued that rewriting found in a various format of a criticism contemporary of translation and also. And also in the Indian concept, modernism thought fundamentally from it Western uh, Western contemporary transforming in the transforming in the between text and readers. In this article, three major language example like Bengali, Malayalam and Marathi, and also we can see a different languages example like a Hindi language example. We can see the Hindi language modernity idea into a Bengali Malayalam similar influence role in the Navi Kavita movement, 1950 impact of translation modernity translation evident like a evident like a mokshibodh. In the mokshibodhis Uttarayana and Andheri mein. These are example of we can see a modernity. And also we can see a Gujarati language. We can see a modernity poet like Umashankar Joshi and Rajendra Shah in his work Kshitij and Itad. Itad was a Gujarati monthly. Itad was a Gujarati monthly magazine that reward modernity. Also, Gujarati poet Umashankar Joshi's work Nishit and Shah's work Pratikalpna. Keep Key points of the article: modernity in Indian market by colonialism, capitalism, economy, and cultural shifting. Modernity in India is the lasting impact of the colonialism shaping a political structure and social cultural norms. Colonial modernity influenced Indian literary and cultural movements. India modernism resisted the Western ideology, opposing a nationalism and formalism. In the we can see the more Indian English writer in their poems use of Western ideas in their poetry. Non-Western modernism challenges Eurocentric view on a modernism, dynamic of a local context crucial in evaluating Indian modernism. Modernist sensibility varies across Indian language due to authenticity and caste and authenticity in religious. Modernist idea in the India different based on factor like different based of factor like a caste, religious poets. For example, different languages show various expression of modernism due to this influence and also modernist idea in Indian different based on a fact and also colonial modernism shape Indian literary and introduction of English language and a Western literary style with a translation. Sudrindranath Datta, B.S. Mardenkar, and Ayappa Panikar example, exemplified Indian modernist poets influenced by Western and indigenous traditions. So, further discussion, I would like to call Ghanshyam Kataria.
The key arguments discussed in this article. The key arguments discussed in these articles are impact of colonial modernity, Indian modernism as a response, non-derivative, non-Western modernism, local dynamics in modernism, translation as an artistic ideological tool, indigenous roots and post-colonial critics, bilingual sensibility and cultural critique, fragmentation and desire in colonial modernity, language as a self-reflexive medium. So the chapter was started as the discussion of how the modernity entered or begin in the India. So the modernity in India as a colonial legacy. So the modernity surely entered as a colonial impact of the imperialistic and colonial rule of British and European powers, and it marked as a colonialism, capitalistic economy, industrialization, Western education models, and rationalism, and it helped to shape a cosmopolitan and individualistic worldview in Indian context. And colonial modernity influenced on literary and cultural movements. So the European modernism was influenced by many movements in the 19th and 20th century, such as reformist and modernistic movements, and it shaped the modernity in European context. But when it comes to Indian context, the colonial modernity itself was the means to generate the modernity in India, as it was the response to the disruption caused by the colonial modernity. Here, Dilip Chitre observes very well that what took nearly a century and a half to happen in England happened within a hurried half century in Indian literature. Modernist sensibility as a oppositional and individualistic. So the the modernity in India is rooted in the aesthetic complexity with colonialism and was essentially oppositional. So it was oppositional to the which was the modernity in the European context. Here, D.R. Nagaraj has pointed out that as nationalism became the ideology of the nation state, writers who had earlier found nationalism to be a form of resistance to colonialism retreated to individualism. As when writers were trying to escape the nationalism or nationalistic view, they choose this new modernity or individualism as their turning point from the national state view. Then the reception of Indian modernism at a global point of view. So divergence of Indian modernism from Western modernism. It was in contrast with the aesthetic features with the Western modernism had a distinct political affiliation and ideological orientation due to its post-colonial context. Because of the post-colonial context, it was in contrast with the modernity that was in the European. It did not align with imperial or metropolitan aspiration, as the Indian modernism is invested in regional cosmopolitan tradition, and it also questioned the colonial legacies. Then post-colonial Indian modernism in global perspective. So it was emerged in the second half of the 20th century, and it was not widely acknowledged as a part of the global modernist movement. The new emerged critics then later argued that non-Western modernism should not be viewed as a derivative version of European practices, and emphasized that they need to document and understand the modernism in diverse post-colonial contexts, that it was also the modernism that emerged, and it is equivalent and important to the which was emerged in the European context. The Indian modernism challenging the Eurocentric discourse on modernism. Scholars like Simon Gaikandi, Susan Friedman, Laura Doyle, Laura Winkle, and Aparna Dharwadkar assert that the non-Western modernisms challenge the Eurocentric nature of the discourse on modernism, and they advocated that the unique trajectories, ideological difference, and dialogues between peripheries, urging a revolution of the center periphery dialect in global modernistic studies. Then now the reception of modernism in the core level of Indian culture, the mediation of Western modernistic discourse in India. It influenced the socio-political upheaval related to the formation of nation state and the realization of the power structure. The dynamic of the local has to be focused into an evolution of the Indian modernism. So the in the modern in the Indian modernism, the local is also as important as the metropolitan. Regional diversity and modernist sensibility. The opposition The oppositional content of modernist sensibility varied in each regional language and in India. So, the as India have the diverse regionality and language and the culture, it is also have this oppositional content of in in itself. So here Amya Dev has observed that modernism was the means by which they turned away Rabindranath, and they had to turn away from their history demanded it. So here in this in Bengali context, Amya Dev is pointing out that to turn away from Rabindranath Tagore, the Bengali writers choose the modernistic view and modernity in literary forms and style to turn away this type of father figures from the literary. culture, so they can move forward in the literary culture. Here in the Kannada context, our Sasidhar writes that the Brahminical and the non-Brahminical modernism in Kannada were part and parcel of a modernism that came as a reaction to the Nehruvian environment. So here in modernism, there is this type of two sides or divisions that also emerges, but they also contributes to the modernism that is whole in as Indian modernism. In the context of here is Kannada, but it is also like in other regional and language type in India. The presence of a father figure like Tagore in Bengali literature was not universally relevant to the development of modernism in other languages such as Kannada or Malayalam, highlighting the diverse factors shaping regional modernist movement. So here in Bengali, there was such a person like Tagore. So they were influenced in for a so long time, and they were in the shadow of that. But if we see in the Kannada and Malayalam context, there was no such a person or a father figure, so they were easily turning to the modernistic view. But for Bengali, they took time to come out of the shadow. So, furthermore, I would ask Trushali Dodia to discuss.
So here I am, Tushari Dodia, to discuss the latter part of this book chapter. This is the book chapter number 15 by E.V. Ramakrishnan, which is divided into 8 parts, and there is an introduction before. So basically, first 3 parts talks about how translations and modernity comes parallel. So translation is the integral project of modernism in Indian languages and assimilating a new poetic into horizon of the native readers expectations, as well as in contesting the claims of prevailing aesthetics norms by breaching its autonomy and authority. So the title of the this book chapter, shifting centers and emerging margins. So this book chapter, in the latter part from 4 to 7 chapters, talks about how this modernism in India is decentering from what is in the Western modernization. So this is not a mere imitation, but rather the reception. So part chapter number part 4 to 7, modernism perceived by 3 writers. So here EV Ramakrishnan takes examples of 3 writers from Bengali, Marathi and Malayalam, though it can be applied in all the languages across India, because all the languages have different cultural diversities and their cultural norms. So here, through these 3 writers from different languages, EV Ramakrishnan tries to establish what he has been addressing in the first 3 chapters about modernity in terms of translation. So translation is not just a linguistic act, but a means to convey and interpret the complexity of artistic expression and ideological perspective within the framework of Indian modernism. That it talks about 3 writers: Sudhindranath Datta from Bengali, B.S. Mardekar from Marathi, and Ayappa Panikar from the Malayalam. There is a chronological trajectory of modernism in India in all these languages, because modernism in Bengali in India began from 1930s, then carried through 1940s and 50s. Marathi it began from 1950s and 60s, whereas in Malayalam it was in late 1970s. Uh, so translation has been central to this modern poetics in India, and all 3 writers, Sudhindranath Datta, Mardekar, and Ayappa Panikar, all three are bilingual, so they knew English as well as their native language, so they can incorporate and translate or assimilate the norms of Western, which is alien terms, and the native both together. So it is like global, local and global, which can be identified as local influence in their writings. So their essays are the basic feature of a new aesthetic against the prevailing romantic nationalist or romantic mysticals. So it has been against the prevailing romantic nationalist and romantic mystical styles. Translate they translate modernism in Indian context, not the mere imitation but rather the reception. They are recepting the ideas that has been prevailing or were prevailing in the Western modernism, and through that perceived ideas, they EV Ramakrishna, sorry, this all three writers from different languages tries to incorporate those ideas in their within their boundaries of culture and language. Sudhindranath Datta, he is a Bengali writer. He argues in his work the necessity of poetry, the importance of poetry across societies, emphasizing its necessary even among the unsophisticated and primitive. So, in this work, he tries to establishes the necessity of poetry in the life of an individual. He also addresses that there are mastery of Western thoughts like the Plato, Aristotle, and all those Western writers. So he rejects the centrality of Enlightenment reason in modern society and advocates for the significance of poetic mind. He argues for the modernist poetic in context of everyday needs, rejecting the idea of writers isolating themselves in an ivory tower. Here he quotes Virginia Woolf, and he says that writer is much connected to the environment. He is not a catalyst. He is not the person who is away from that. So he is the part of it, and it is in context of everyday life. So he rejects the isolation of writers. So there is a progressive role of writer and the role of masses in literary traditions. So Sudhindranath Datta is talking about the relation of mass literary tradition and progressive role of writers, which has been told or addressed in the Western thoughts of, that there is a dominance of a writer's role and this elitism. So basically, this modernist movement in India, modernism in India talks and rejects or is against these elitist or high cultures and high culture writings. He also criticized Anglicists for neglecting their duty to emancipate people from their colonial illusions. He highlights the complexity faced by Indian modernists, balancing cosmopolitan values with connection to tradition. So they are much connected to tradition, and they are bringing the ideas from West. So he tries to, or modernist writers tries to incorporate the tradition and the new ideas of West. Modernism is a part of larger decolonizing project, not mindless celebration of Western values and European avant-garde movements. So modernism is much differed from this imitation or celebration of the Western values. Here he gives E.V. Ramakrishnan gives an example of Sudhindranath Datta's The Camel Bird poem, which reflects a critical spirit and desire to reinvent tradition from a cosmopolitan perspective. So this bird is shown that has been away from the tradition, and how the bird is being like alien in the world. He depicts a threatened landscape where the poet and the bird are disconnected or disjointed from the past tradition. So he takes back to the tradition, but he also at the same time not forgetting the newness as well. The camel bird embodies the interior of a colonized community reflecting a quest for humanity and a sense of community in a world marked by violence and isolation. B.S. Mardekar, he is a Marathi poet writer, and he transformed Marathi poetry and its direction and dynamics. Here, one point should be noted that he was much aware about the entire tradition of Marathi poetry from its beginning. And he, all three writers, Mardekar, Panikar, or Sudhindranath Datta, all three are inspired by Western thoughts and especially by T.S. Eliot. Uh, he went back to Marathi poetic tradition to reinvent the saint poets like Tukaram Ramdas for a modern audience. So he tries to, like T.S. Eliot, what he does in Westland, he tries to bring that concept in his poetry by reinventing all the saint poets, their ways of life, and try to incorporate it with the modern life. Mardekar intervened in Marathi literary tradition as an insider who had mastered insight given by an alien tradition. So he has he is inside the tradition, he knows about everything about the tradition, but at the same time he also have a mastery over the insight given by the tradition. Alien means West traditions. Engagement with tradition was complex, reflecting both alienation from and allegiance to Marathi literary tradition. So it has been like you are just keeping both the things. A modernist techniques such as dislocating word order and creating a collage of images to convey a dehumanized city space in his poetry. There is an obscurity, this devastating irony to navigate contradictions and convey the urban existential experience. His poem, Mice in the Wet Barrel Died. In this poem, he uses a metaphor of mice to depict the morbid and malevolent aspect of modern life, emphasizing the blind search for the survival in the hostile world. So, this poem is also trying to bring what has been done by Tukaram and Ramdas, and the life and the sufferings related to this saint poetry. Ayappa Panikar, he was first romantic and transformed to modernist poetry. And his seminal work is Kurukshetra. He introduced world poetry to Malayalam readers through translations and contributed to a shift in literary sensibility. He is a translator, obviously, so he brought the literary sensibility and a shift in Malayalam poetry for readers. He is also influenced by Eliot, highly influenced by Eliot. According to him, there should be invention of rhythm and resonance that befit emotion, and he urges the Malayalam poets to reject prosodic element in favor of rhythmic free verse. So he urges and rejects the prosodic elements in the poetry, and he also suggests writers to not to go in the mere imitation. Modernist poets must reject the allegorical and didactic, focusing on the complex relation between form and content. His poem Kurukshetra is a parallel, we can say, parallel to T.S. Eliot's Westland, and this poem is in 294 lines and 4 parts. Same as T.S. Eliot is having a structure of the poem in 5 parts. Like Eliot, he is using the fragmentation in the whole poetry. He is bringing the examples of Ram, then Oedipus, Brahma, Vishnu, all the things, and making hodgepodge and try to convey what has been conveyed. But what the point differentiating is that Eliot is talking into other tradition, while this Ayappa Panikar is trying to reflect or give understanding through their own cultural norms, so that can be understood. It opens up with images reflecting a decline in moral values and societal disruptions like Eliot's Wasteland. Here, there is a lines from Bhagavad Gita of this moral decline of moral values and disruptions. There are various sorts of conflicts within this poetry: self and society, private and public, as existential confrontation and redemption. And the poem ends with the final desire for redemption through imagination. Here the poet brings the example of Brahma and Vishnu creating rebirth, everything. So he is trying to bring everything like T.S. Eliot and try to explain the fragmentary life of people within the culture. uh, so let us move to the conclusion. So uh, the emergence of modernism in non-European countries, it cannot be seen in terms of European centers and non-European peripheries. It has its own ways of looking, so it is not what it, and it cannot be identified in terms of European or non-European terms. So, indigenous roots of modernism, as the writers, poets have done, they are bringing the tradition, and with this tradition and indigenous roots, they are trying to convey the ideas in a newer form. Writers engage with Western modernity, selectively assimilating its resources for their own terms. Assimilate resources of Western modernity for their own terms. They translate modernity or modernism through the optics of post-colonial modernism. So here it is what Tejaswini says about the post-colonial and decolonizing things. Here here E.V. Ramakrishnan talks about differently, because he tries to say that modernism or Indian translations are much away. Modernist movement is much away, which is not having that hegemonic things, but rather it moved away, drifts away from this elite and high culture. Internal didactic and external dialogic. So internal didactic in their own culture, that allows them to be critical outsider, valuing internal critique of Western modernism while distrusting the grand narratives of resistance. So it does both the things. So it allows them to be critical as outsider of their culture, and at the same time they value the intended critic of Western modernization. Writers adopt a critical outsider stance toward their own culture. Like all the three writers were bilingual, and there is a bridge between the native and the alien tradition. So they are making a bridge between the native language and the alien or the Western ideologies and traditions. Translation becomes a transformative force, allowing the writers to reimagine their world and question established norm. It is a self-reflexive movement to the West, takes on a distinctly post-colonial essence as it challenges prevailing limits of freedom, and the language has been its medium to convey the ideas to English to Malayalam, Malayalam to English, or Bengali or Marathi. The writers, positioned at the intersection of cultures, navigate the complexity of identity, language, tradition, offering valuable insight into the transformative power of literature in the post colonial milieu. There is an existential angst, it has been in the works of all three writers, especially in Panikar's writers, where he talks about the fragmentation of human life. Writers navigate complexity of identity, language, and tradition, offering insight into the transformative power of literature. It questions prevailing limits of freedom, and at last, uh, title. If we see the whole chapter through its title in a in a sentence or two. So, shifting centers and emerging margins in translation studies in India. So, these by talking about all three writers, E.V. Ramakrishnan tries to explain or assert that it has the centers has been shifted from the hegemonic perspective, and those who were in periphery like non-European cultures, it has been like emerging. So the margins are emerging, whereas centers has been shifted in Indian modernism perspective. So these are the references. Thank you so much. Now we are open for questions.
Asna, how did Indian poets like Datta, Martikar and Panikar use modernizing translation from 19th century to 1917 to challenge cultural and literary norms?
In Indian poet like Datta Panikar use so in Indian poet like Datta Panikar use foreignizing translation for 1950 and 1960. Uh, 1960, so he include sensibility and challenges in cultural sensibility in cultural norms and translation in context of a modernist idea.
So, Charlie, my question is that as in your slides you said that translation is central to modernist poetics, then how do you think that it helps these three writers to connect with and be part of the community at the same time?
Yes. Uh, Translation is a central. Yes. Translation is central to modernist poetics, as it has been also asserted by E.V. Ramakrishnan. So, in this modernist perspective, like when we are trying to connect with the community or traditions or the languages and their cultures, so it has been vital to look at the things. So, translation, the all three writers, Panikar, or Sudhindranath, all three writers are bilingual. So the translation, they are not also merely translating the things, but they are not merely translating the works, or but they are transmitting or they are recepting the things. So it has been vital. Translation has been vital to like uh, be interconnected with each other.
Kanisham, my question is that in what ways do non-Western modernisms challenge Eurocentric views on modernism?
So the non-Western modernism were also big was also because of the modernism came from the colonial powers. The colonial rules or imperial rules already have change the cultural or political situations of the non-Western countries. They have drastically changed already the cultural positioning. So when the modernism came into that uh, non-Western countries, it gave them the opportunity to oppose the colonialism and the rules of the imperialism, and they came with the different take of the modernism, as they were not the uh, they were not like the Western countries, or they were rooted in the local, or we can say the regionality and the culturality. So when they take the modernism, they also give it a new form, and they capture with their social and culturality. So that way um, the view of non-Western modernism challenges the Eurocentric views of the modernism, and they also take stand of their own modernism in their own way. Thank you.